So we've got an amazing lineup. What I'm going to do is just take 6 or 7 minutes, get a couple of ideas on the table to kind of frame the conversation, and then introduce the panelists, and then sit the heck down and let them talk. They're each going to speak for about 7 or 8 minutes. We'll then have a little bit of conversation up here. We'll then open it up and give you guys a chance to hop in. What I will ask is when we throw it out to you guys, that we not get floor speeches. This is Washington. We have more than enough floor speeches. I'll ask that you actually ask a question. If we don't see a question coming 15, 20 seconds in, we'll give somebody else a shot. All right. Now, one of the great problems of talking about retaining and training great leaders is that it's real easy for this stuff to become banal and pointless. I don't know anybody who's not in favor of better leaders. I don't even know what that means. It's like, you know, we're all in favor of better teaching. Woohoo! So I think the first thing we need to do is we've got to be really careful when we're talking in legislative session, when we're talking in an advocacy role about improving school leadership. We've got to be real careful to be thoughtful about what do we actually mean. If we mean we want 100,000 better principals and that they are smarter and able to work 90-hour weeks instead of 65-hour weeks, I think we're going to have trouble getting 100,000 of them, much less 100,000 APs on top, behind them. What I think we mean is people who are actually better at the stuff that the job requires. That means better at mentoring faculty. It means better at evaluating and supporting their teachers. It means better at handling relationships with parents and constituents. It means better at supporting curriculum. If you start to do it this way, you realize that these guys are actually doing a hell of a lot of stuff. They're only spending, of course, to most principal time studies, probably 30 or 40% of their time on any of this. They're spending a lot on all kinds of other distractions and poor time management and running around trying to stop the kids from lighting a fire behind the, underneath the bleachers. So part of better leadership is not just getting better people. It is us being smarter about how we're creating that role, about the systems into which we're putting these principals, about what superintendents and central officials are doing to create clear job expectations, to make sure somebody else is helping to solve these problems, and not just throw all this stuff on the back of somebody who's supposed to be working 85 or 90 hours a week to make it work. All this matters when we're wearing our reform hats here at Jeb Summit in two particular ways. One, right now, a lot of folks in state legislatures and a lot of advocates are trying to solve problems that we don't actually need to be solving. The teacher evaluation problem is not actually a statutory problem. It's a problem that we don't have school leaders who are able or willing or inclined to actually evaluate their staff in a meaningful way. We actually don't need to be having these crude, heavy-handed, intensive, and mean-spirited debates about teacher evaluation if we simply were confident that we had responsible and effective school management, but we don't. So when we're talking about better school leadership, one thing we mean is how do we make sure between our support and our training and our advocacy that we're getting school leaders who can simply execute their job well so we don't have to fix it legislatively. A second thing we mean is that right now, a lot of reformers are working hard to push through things like teacher evaluation, Act 10 in Wisconsin, all kinds of other opportunities to decentralize control over resources. If principals don't make use of these opportunities, it was wasted effort. Cynics and skeptics can say, aha, you picked these fights for no reason whatsoever. So too often reformers say, well, we can create opportunity, but it's somebody else has got to make sure that the leaders actually do it. Actually, if we fight hard to win policy fights and the folks on the ground don't take advantage, honestly, we might be worse off than if we never fought the policy fight in the first place. We will have spilled a lot of blood and sweat for nothing whatsoever. Now, final point, and then I want to kind of introduce the panelists. When we talk about better preparation and better training and support, we kind of talk about it as there's this bunch of jobs that principals need to do. I think that's the wrong way to frame it. I've got a book coming out in a couple months called Cage Busting Leadership, and in it I lay a real simple kind of dichotomy out. Being a principal actually entails there's two halves to the principalship equation. One is the stuff we always talk about, instructional leadership, coaching, consensus, mentoring, working on curriculum evaluation, critical stuff. We do this poorly. Ed schools do not do a good job of preparing people to do this today, and we've got to get a heck of a lot better. But there's the other half of the leadership equation, which we don't even do poorly, which we don't do at all. And that is that principals are being asked to take over outdated, anachronistic, hard-to-move organizations. And in order to make this kind of change, principals need more than just to be good at the job they already do. They need to have the levers to really rethink and change these organizations. This is why it's harder to be a principal than it is to be a new hire at Google or Facebook or Apple, because these are young organizations which are growing and evolving. Principals going into schools that are 30 or 50 or 80 years old and systems that are 50 or 80 or 100 years old actually have to be able to remake the constraints in which they work. And we do nothing, even in high-quality principal preparation like new leaders and Fisher Fellows. We do little or nothing, even in those programs, to prepare principals for this challenge. So what I want to suggest is when we talk about better training, it can't just be better at teacher evaluation and better instructional leadership. It's also got to be equipping principals to think about these other kinds of changes. And I can't think of anybody better to help us think about all of the dimensions of this than the three folks who are next to me. We're going to start with Christine Campbell. Christine is the policy director and senior research analyst at the Center for Reinventing Public Ed. She heads up the school portfolio team there. She also heads up the ed leadership practice. She has written widely on these questions with one of my own personal mentors, Paul Hill. And she'll be speaking to us really very much from a research perspective. Speaking from somebody who actually has to do all this stuff day in, day out that the rest of us get to talk about, we have Alonso. Dr. Alonso is a superintendent of Baltimore. He himself is somebody who comes with what we call a non-traditional background. While he was at Harvard, he wasn't satisfied just getting his doctorate. He also went ahead and got a JD. He held a series of ranking positions under Joel Klein in the New York City schools. He's been superintendent in Baltimore, performing the best performance results in the history, in the contemporary history of Baltimore during the last several years. And finally, we have Anitere Flores, Florida State Senator. Anitere previously was Jeb Bush's advisor on education policy during her time in the Florida State House. She chaired various committees dealing with pre-K to 12 issues, and she now plays a role on these same issues on the Budget Committee in the Senate. She also is president of Doral College? Doral College, my apologies. With that, let me sit the heck down and Christine, hand it to you.
Great, thank you. So I work at the Center on Reinventing Public Education, and we study sort of three main buckets of work: charter schools and innovation, finance and productivity, and remissioning states and districts. And it's in this work that we got so involved with the idea of school leadership, because when we talk with superintendents and principals and districts, they tell us that as they approach trying to give more people autonomy with accountability, there's just a dearth of leaders who are ready for that, that kind of new role. And then we also come at it from a state perspective, where states want to know what kind of levers they can pull to support these districts. So for the past year, we've been doing some studies and work with a couple of different states, and we'll sort of feature those today. But just sort of starting out with the idea that principles matter, I think that's come up a few times in the last day and a half. And then we'll talk about a couple of tools that the center has developed. One sort of a data guide to help people think a little more strategically about what the workforce issue might be. And then also sort of a framework to think about policies in a more comprehensive way. So a lot of studies say that teachers are the most important in-school influence, and that principals are second. And then principals really are the people who are going to hire and develop and remove low-performing teachers. So when you consider this, we actually think that principals are actually the most important. So really 2 is 1 in this case. And that principals really are the single most important factor. Looking at some recent research on high-quality and highly effective principals in high-poverty schools, what we see is that these are data from Texas, 7,000 principals over the course of 6 years. And it's highly positive all the way, but you really see it take off at about 75th percentile, where schools have enormous numbers of students that are low income. So the impact of a strong leader in a high poverty school only grows with the number of students that fit that category. So extremely important. And as the Secretary mentioned this morning, getting those leaders into those schools is so incredibly important. We talked a little bit about the multitude of tasks that principals face, but what do highly effective principals do? They set expectations, and they model them. They build relationships and manage people, and they kind of provide this instructional and organizational management. They do so many things, but these are the things that highly effective principals really focus their time on. And this job is changing. So in the last few years, 21 states have passed legislation to require more rigorous teacher evaluations, and that amounts to about 70,000 principals who need to really be much more skillful in how they assess their workforce. Those are big numbers. In addition, all of the SIG options required a change out of principal, and there was, I think, probably the biggest challenge among those who were studying the SIG schools was finding school leaders who had experience and a track record of being able to do this. And in many cases, especially when the SIG schools were in more rural places, they just ended up swapping principals from one school to another. So there's definitely a dearth of experienced and strong leadership. And we're talking about portfolio districts, portfolio leaders. These are some of the more bolder districts in the country. They say this is one thing that holds them back, and the same with high-performing CMOs. So just kind of making the case for all that. So given that principals matter so much, what kind of role have states been playing in making sure that there's sort of a growing pipeline? Well, it turns out they haven't been doing very much. It's been pretty passive. The credentialing boards decides who can become a principal. So just sort of starting from the hiring point, who gets that? Well, you need to have experience teaching in classrooms. In this case, in New Jersey, you need 5 years as a classroom teacher. You need to go through an administrative degree program, et cetera. So what's in the administrative degree? A few years ago, Art Levine, former president of Teachers College, or dean of Teachers College, kind of did a catalog of all the preparation programs in the country that were training principals, and took a look at what the most common courses were that they were required to take. Again, the Secretary mentioned this morning, it's these courses that actually don't end up having a lot to do with school quality and school outcomes. So things like education psychology and the history and philosophical foundations of education. And the red bars show how people rated these in terms of their usefulness on the job. So we also decided to take a look more closely at some of the preparation programs and see who they, the sort of level of selectivity, who gets to enter. And in one state, we took the biggest producers, and we called around to all of them and found out, sort of what their minimum requirements are. In this case, very minimum GPA, and none of them had a minimum GRE score, so very low selectivity. And then even once they were accepted, they didn't collect that information, so they still didn't know how those students, the ones that they actually took, how they performed in the past. And they really had a hard time even saying how many people were in their program, so they really didn't know how many people they were producing in any given year, and they certainly didn't track placement. So only one of them did. They had about a 65% placement rate, but the rest pretty much summed up in the quote there that they just didn't follow this. But principal development pays off, and when you look at the highest performing charter schools, you see that what they're doing is that they are identifying folks already in their ranks and not waiting for them to self-select. It's pretty passive, as we've seen sort of in the traditional role. So they identify them, they promote them and train them and kind of groom them into that position. Fit really matters, experience, and their ability. So thinking more strategically about this actually should pay off. So we also looked at state policies, and we took a look at one state. They had a 5-year plan they were pretty proud of, and we thought, well, let's see how this rolls out in terms of what they're thinking about principals. So we cataloged each of the policies that they had, and you can see that it's very heavily weighted on the roles of teachers and things that were going to happen to them, and pretty few number. And we were very generous. When they said educator, we presumed principal as well. So this may have been overly generous. But so then let's take a look at what policy states are enacting. So in the last few years, there's been a lot of activity on certain fronts, and you can see starting around 09-10 with Race to the Top that there was a pretty big spike in certain policies, certainly evaluations up there, incentives, and then there's been a leveling off about creating new routes and new institutes. But these are sort of a grab bag of policies, and they may not get to the problems that states and districts face. So some of the issues may be that it's not really a district shortage or even a state shortage, but a certain kind of schools shortage. So the most challenging schools and maybe geographic challenges. We've talked a lot about this problem of the job not really being one people want. If you're an ambitious, talented person, do you really want to take on a job where your hands are pretty much tied behind your back? And then, some of these policies really have no connection to student outcomes. So sort of looking for a tighter connection to how these things actually relate. And then lastly, some of them don't address some of the bigger issues at all, which is in states with principal unions, how you can actually move out a low-performing principal. So one place to start is by looking at workforce data, just to kind of get a sense. Instead of just saying we need to do a lot more with principal prep and get new principals in, is there really an issue about training people? And when we looked at Iowa, yes, in about 5 years' time, about 50% of their principal population will be eligible to retire. Now, whether or not they do is another question. I think people are kind of pushing that off longer. But the idea is that there is an opportunity there to really rethink who and what kind of skills they'll be looking for. But here's Indiana, and they have about a third of their principals about to retire in 5 years. And so really 70% are going to be on the job for quite a long time. The blue bars sort of indicate the number of years currently that they've been on the job. And so it's a really different set of strategies that they might want to be considering, which include things like really developing the people that they have and using good evaluation to move out people, because they're not going to age out anytime soon. So thinking more strategically about that. Also, just looking at Wisconsin, what we found, so many times states are at a loss what to do about principals because it is such a local issue. It's a district issue. And when we looked at Wisconsin, we found that they have a relatively small number that are about to retire. But when we looked more closely about which districts they were in and the size of those districts, it turns out that the retirement is going to be heavy in these very tiny districts where half the principals will be gone. So, a district of 4, 2 will retire. So it just sort of gives Wisconsin a better sense of the kind of issue they'll be facing. This is incredibly blurry, and you're not meant to read it, I guess, but this is a data guide that we put together, and the main thrust is just to say it's not that many questions that actually give you a pretty good sense of what you might want to be looking for. States collect a lot of this data, but they don't analyze it necessarily in a way that's very useful for them. So you want to keep track of how many people are going to be moving out. You want to know who's struggling, so who's new and who's in low-performing schools. And then you want some sense of the supply. Where are they coming from? And as we've talked about over the last 2 days, are they any good? So which programs produce your best people? I don't know any state really that can answer that question, possibly Louisiana. So these are things that states actually can get busy with. The other thing is to think sort of more strategically about the array of policies. So we've kind of developed this framework of getting the right work, so a job that talented and ambitious people would want, the right people, sort of opening up the possibilities to more varied backgrounds and more maybe more junior people, and then getting people into the right places, so incentives to get them to go to the more challenged schools. So I'm just going to briefly touch on a couple things and then turn it over.
Why don't we save some
Yeah,
minutes for later?
I was going to say, good, great.
Okay, great.
So you're on.
Terrific, thanks. Andrés, 5 years ago, you dramatically reorganized the Baltimore system. You reduced central office by a third. You replaced 75% of your school leaders. You moved enormous amount of control over budget down to principals. Curious, how do you go about getting the caliber of principals you need to make this work? How do you give principals the support they need? How do you hold them accountable? How have you guys done this?
So first of all, let me say that that we've done all this. I'm not sure that we've done it as successfully as we wanted to do it, and I think we're trying to learn from what's happening throughout the country, and in a sense, we are trying certain things, betting on certain theories of action. And 5-6 years ago, when I got to Baltimore, what I inherited was a bipolar system with a large number of schools, traditional schools, very compliance-driven, bound, principals having very little control over people, time, and money, and then a small number of schools, charter schools, which in Maryland are district-driven, that had enormous autonomy, energy, sense of possibility, and even in the public discourse, the charters were thought of as the schools that had a future, the traditional schools where the schools that people were fleeing from. So as a function of what my context was, and also driven by what I had learned in New York and other places, we push hard to level the playing field and to drive certain levers to schools, in part to change the conversation about responsibility. Every conversation with a principal or teachers in a failing school came back to the question of somebody, or to the notion of somebody else being responsible. So we pushed on this idea of levers at the school level, while at the same time, and in this sense we were a little different than the other high-profile reform districts, we also had a very public discussion about what needed to become consistent across the district, what needed to be bound in the autonomy. And we pushed very, very hard on notions of accountability, while at the same time maintaining the idea that the district had to be a source of support in order to push this work. Many people left the profession, and many we push hard so that they leave the profession. And what we have learned over time is that this is unbelievably difficult work, that there are no silver bullets, that even talking about the principalship without differentiating among schools is problematic. Being a principal in an elementary school is very different than being a principal in a high school. Being a principal in a school with middle-class parents is very, very different than being a principal in a school with huge concentration of poverty, and we are mostly about schools with huge concentrations of poverty. We also learned that even in thinking of the principalship as a single person question was highly problematic, because very effective principals tend to build teams. We were pushing people into schools on a kind of heroic leader model, and in many cases they were floundering, even though we had every sense that they were going to be successful, and that forced us to think about context and how to facilitate the work for people once they got to difficult situations. We also began to think very, very hard about how passive, you used the word passive, or maybe Rick did, and how accidental this work is in most districts, as in, who becomes a principal? Well, usually an assistant principal, and what happens around the assistant principals in most schools? They're the people who handle the discipline. And then we put them in situations where they're supposed to be instructional leaders. And as we were thinking of the work in alignment with the work that we were doing with teachers, and we were pushing very hard on career ladders and different ways of compensating teachers, you can't think about the principalship without thinking of the impact of the principal on teachers. So we started thinking on predictive notions and on making this work intentional rather than accidental. So right now, and I'm getting to your end slide in a way, and I'll go to the end right away. We are in the midst of what I consider R&D work with the Noise Foundation as a key backer in a partnership with the New Teacher Project, New Leaders for New Schools, and ERS, Education Resource Strategies, in helping us think of the pipeline in a very coherent way around this question of who can we predict might be a great leader down the line. So not making it accidental, making it intentional. What kind of experiences we provide for these potential leaders over time, so that we map backward from what we now believe is a key to the work. And then creating the pathways within the school district so that down the line, we're not putting out positions in May and finding that the people coming to the table are simply not good enough. We're also thinking of that work in the context of retention and socialization, and structures within the district that should be about developing people in leadership capacity. And part of what we have learned is that culture is immense, and I agree that it is the culture of schools rather than laws and unions and policy frames that are the greatest obstacle in this question of evaluation. Capacity is a huge challenge, so how do we get people who have the capacity? And the span of the job is hugely problematic, especially if we want principals to be entrepreneurial and to be changing culture. The political nature of the principalship hasn't been thought through enough, and I'll just give you an example of what we're dealing with. We are just yesterday announced a 10-year master plan for Baltimore, which promises to close 26 buildings. And before I went out public with a plan, I met with every single principal in a building that was going to close, and then I met with all the principals as a group, and my message was, every word that you utter magnifies by 1,000 anything I might say, and your role as a political leader in this reform effort is hugely important. Because part of my experience over the past 6 years is that in schools where we have had problems closing, for example, it's been because there has been a leader on the ground who hasn't not been working with us. At some level, they've been working with the old culture. So the political nature of the role, the capacity of principals to build teams and lead teams and delegate responsibilities. There's no way that one person can do everything that a principal is supposed to be doing. Support from the central context around the pieces that we're asking principals to do differently. If I'm asking my principals to now manage a budget where they control 80% of the dollars, well, before they were only controlling 3% of the dollars, I have redefined the job. And in many places, what you find is that no one is thinking of what that means in terms of implementation on the ground. So people end up either doing the same things that we're doing before because it's safe, or they do things that are highly problematic. This notion of the integration of the incentives that we're using, sometimes there's huge contradiction between the incentives at the district level, the incentives at the state level, and the incentives in the informal culture of the schools. How do we figure out a way to think of, what is the actual reward in the job, and where do people derive their authority, which in many schools is about pushing against the central office or whatever is coming from the outside. Those things are very explicit elements of the work that we're doing. And at some level, the win for us is, and we joke about this all the time, which is that we want to be like the Ravens. As in, if I talk to Dick Cass and I go into that draft room they have a system. They have a 30-30-30 system. They know exactly who every person is who's coming through the draft. They know their needs deeply. They know ahead of time. They're planning 4 years down the line about who's going to be the middle linebacker. That doesn't happen in school systems. And this work that we're doing with our partner organizations, which I think is also helpful around just aligning things that are usually very disconnected, how you're working with new teachers, with how you're working with principals, for example. It's all about getting us to be that kind of organization, and in quite often in the conversation there's a cultural deficit assumption. There's a lot of conversation about talent, et cetera, and I believe that if I have 6,500 teachers working for me right now, so as a matter of probability theory, I have 300 to 400 extraordinary people in my classrooms. And if I am not able, as the leader of the organization, to create systems that identify who those people are, then something's wrong at our end. And a lot of the work for me has been about, and it's been unbelievably hard to get people to start thinking in these ways. A lot of the work has been to sort of push so that we're thinking slightly differently about some of these notions. If we can get to that level of identification, then I think we solve the problem of the hard-to-staff schools, because we have some amazing people in those schools that people think are failing. The question is, are we doing a good enough job of preparing them for the challenge of the job? The most frustrating part of this job so far has been about having pushed so hard around notions of accountability and then having to rehire for schools where I have made hard decisions around the tenure of principals. And that every time I do that, then that just tells me that we're not where we need to be, that we haven't created those systems around sustainability. In an interesting way, and I'll just take another second, the teaching profession is changing very fast around expectations around staying in the profession. I mean, I'm hiring lots of teachers. In my entry class last year, 40% of the teachers said that they were not going to be a teacher 5 years down the line. That's not true for principals. Principals become principals, and they want to be principals forever. And part of the challenge for us has been into pushing them to the idea that, okay, you could be a principal forever, but maybe you shouldn't be staying in the same school. So that's another element of this work.
Nice. I mean, I like the Baltimore Ravens point. I mean, one of the interesting things is you don't find a lot of well-run organizations, pro sports team, or everybody else, who says, well, ownership's a mess. We don't know what the hell we're doing, but if we hire a great coach, everything will work out. Rarely actually works out that way. Anitere, I mean, you guys in Florida have been at the front end of a lot of this nationally. Back in '99 under Jeb, you guys pushed some terrific stuff. The Equity in School Level Funding Act in particular, which pushed resources to school level, which allowed school level leaders to carry over resources 1 year to the next. Love it if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges at the state level and some of what y'all have seen.
Sure thing. Great. Thank you all. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. Are there any legislators in the group? A couple, right? Okay, good. Because hopefully this can be kind of one of your action items of, I think a lot of the times when we come to conferences, and this is probably the lone exception to what I'm about to say, but most conferences you go to, I feel that all we do is you just kind of talk about the talking about. This is honestly probably the only conference where people leave here and are energized and have action items and a list of bullet points of saying, these are the things I want to accomplish. And Governor Bush then holds us accountable so that a year from now, he goes around the room and asks us, well, what have you done? What have you done since last year? And so hopefully this might be one of the things that you can move forward on that. The issue of principals, I think, as everyone here has mentioned, is obviously very important because the principal sets the tone for the school. What type of school is going to be in? Is this going to be a school where when you walk into a classroom, the kids all stand up and say, "Good morning, Miss Flores, how are you?" When you walk into a classroom, is everyone paying attention? Are there some of the kids that are in the back of the room, playing on the phone? So the principal really sets that tone. If you have a good principal that demands respect, well, his or her teachers are going to be willing to implement some of the things that they put in place. So one of the things that we often say is that in order to bring that level of professionalism to principals, we want to treat them as the CEOs of their school. And then unfortunately, what we do is we say, you can be the CEO of your school, however, we're gonna tell you who you have to hire, we're gonna tell you how you have to spend your money, and if you save money at the end of the year, you have to give it back to us. You can't keep it. So imagine doing that to any CEO. They wouldn't be very successful, nor would they want to be CEO of that company. And so in 2000, in the midst of several different reforms that we did, one of the complaints that several legislators and just parents and principals that we received were, two things. Number one, if as a principal I am innovative in the way that I set out my budget, and we save money, be it on after school programs or on buying better pencils. If I save that money, there is no incentive for me to save the money, because if I don't use every single dollar that I have, I'm gonna get a budget cut next year, because obviously I didn't need that much money, and then I have to, what's even worse, give the money back to the school district. And then number two complaint was schools are just not being funded at the same level. So you have schools that are generating more money because they have more students, and then you have the school board members having a vast level of autonomy on how much money each school was going to get. And so what we passed was this Equity in School Level Funding Act that says that phased in over 4 years, principals, schools rather, would get money back to them in a direct proportion of the money that was generated at that school. So in 2000, that percentage was 50%. That kind of thing scares me at first, and thinking of, if we had to set a standard that says that the school has to keep 50% of what they generate, you shudder to think what some of those percentages were prior to that. As you said, in some schools it might have been 10%. And so over the 4 years, we implemented it over 4 years. Year one, 50%, then 65%, then 80%, and then by 2003 and 04, 90% of the funds generated by that school would come back to the school. The funds that are eligible are three sources of funds. One is the FEFP, which is our kind of catch-all student formula, your per student funding, and then two other pots of dollars, which are discretionary, are just kind of discretionary lottery funds. So those funds that are generated at that area would go back to the school. So really what this is an incentive for the principals to be able to spend wisely. As I said prior to this, innovative principals that kind of made the right spending decisions were punished in most senses for being innovative. And then they'd have to sit back and see, well, principals maybe, a couple schools down, just kind of spending money. And I'm sure a lot of you have seen this, that towards the end of the fiscal year, principals, are just gonna go out and just start spending money and buying stuff, because if not, then they can't keep that. And then you walk into the school, and then, you go into the, into the storage closet, and you see a room full of unused textbooks, or a room full of unused computers. Those are the horror stories that happen day in and day out across all levels of government, but we see that's a lot in schools. And so we had to find a way to say, there has to be a better way to run the system. However, I want to spend a little bit of time talking about how, nothing is perfect. When I was talking about some of the folks about what I was going to talk about today, I said, wow, that sounds really great that we've had this law in place since 2004. Why am I still getting complaints 8 years later from principals saying that that's not the case? The one issue that we have, I think, is a bit of an implementation issue. The Department of Education has never done any sort of study to figure out are school districts really complying with this. And my gut would tell me that while the majority of school districts probably are, and most schools probably are, there are unfortunately probably dozens of schools, if not more, across the state of Florida where this just isn't happening. Because I know that I've spoken to principals that they don't know that this is a law. They don't know that they have this autonomy. They're still being told by the school district that any money that they don't spend has to go back to it. So one of my action items when I go back this legislative session is to get a state of the state as to, is this law actually being implemented? And if it's not, what are we going to do about it? And what's the stick that we're going to have for the school districts that are not implementing this? And then I think another place where we could improve is that while the law says that the funds that you generate go back to your school, there are still lots of strings attached over how you spend the money. And this goes part of to the kind of that bigger problem of that where's that fine line and that balance between local control and having uniform standards or issues, because not all the funds are eligible for this equity in school funding. So the way that our funding formula works is you have our big catch-all formula called the FEFP, but then over the years, and the pendulum on this has kind of swung both ways, over the years, as legislators and the governor, heard complaints saying, there are no money for textbooks. There's no money for transportation. There's no money for after-school programs. So over the years, in order to combat that, what the state of Florida did is that we took some items out of the big formula and then put them into specific categories. And we said, okay, you say you don't have enough money for instructional materials? Well, here we go. We have identified this pot of money that is going to go only to instructional materials. Can't go anywhere else. You have an issue with transportation, here's a pot of money that goes specifically to transportation. So now, and school districts are happy with that for a little bit, but now the pendulum is swinging and saying, oh my gosh, we don't have any control where the money goes. You tell us we have to spend all this money on instructional materials, on transportation, on after-school program, so we don't have enough money for other basic things like teacher raises. So the pendulum is sort of swinging back in Florida, where there's a growing movement to just eliminate those categoricals completely. As in most things, the right place is probably somewhere in the middle. But as I stated, certainly one of the places where we can improve on that is, number one, ensuring that if we're going to keep categoricals, that have that instructional material or transportation money or whatever go back to that, at least for instructional materials or for after-school programs, have that go back to the school district. Or more likely than not, where we're at a time right now is that where we're probably going to be looking at reforming the budgetary process in general and those categoricals. What's that happy medium between saying, yes, you have money for textbooks and technology, but don't go out and rush to spend it, or you're afraid that you're not going to have it. So, there's still some challenges with us, trying to make this perfect. But I think that it goes a major step in the right direction of saying, at least on paper, and certainly for most of the schools across the state where this is being implemented, you can feel comfortable that the money that you are generating, that school district and that community is generating, is going to go back to the school district. And more importantly than that, I think, is the provision that says, don't be afraid to save money, don't be afraid to be efficient, because you're going to be rewarded for that. I think that's really the most important thing and the most important takeaway from that, and hopefully we can go back in the state, and you all can go back to other states and try and implement something serious to do that, to make that a small step in the right direction of really making and treating principals as CEOs of their schools.
Great. You know, one of the things that brings up for me, Anitere, is, you know, when I train school leaders at UPenn and Rice and elsewhere, you know, there's this conversation. They say, well, you know, I have resources and I can't do anything. You know, the federal grants coordinator tells me that I can't move my Title II dollars. The special ed coordinator tells me that I'm not actually allowed to restaff. So I guess, you know, so one thing, Christine, is you had mentioned some of these high-performing charter schools as kind of exemplars of good leadership. And I guess I wonder about that. I mean, I know KIPP got $50 million under I-3, but, you know, Sports Illustrated just recently did a story about all of the superstar players who came out of University of Southern California a few years back, and they all got paid a ton of money and picked high by teams, and most of them have stunk. Turns out that they looked a lot better than they were because they were at USC. So I guess I wonder, how confident are you, and what's the source of confidence that these high-performing charters actually have got real expertise in leadership, and not just that they've got systems where they get good people and those people succeed?
No, I think that's a really good question, and I know that's a criticism of some of the leadership development programs. Some of the ones that seem to produce more high flyers is that, well, maybe they're just really good at selection, and it's not that they're actually building people up in their program. But I guess the takeaway might be, I mean, you know, some of it is just look at the outcomes, right? So if KIPP manages to keep producing some of the highest performing charter schools, and they must be doing something right. Maybe they are just creaming from the top. And they definitely do. I mean, the number of people who apply to get into the Fisher program who are already, you know, significantly experienced leaders in KIPP schools that don't get into the Fisher program is pretty amazing. But I think that it's very intentional development, and then you know, sort of directing people out that aren't able to do it. So, you know, I agree. There's probably some overstatement on some level, but the distance between what we're doing now, as Dr. Alonso was saying, sort of that just waiting to see what happens, or people sort of inheriting roles versus being tapped and developed and recruited and maybe suggested that it isn't right for you. I think there's a big distance between those two.
Andrés, yeah, I want to, you know, one of the things when you talk to state legislators is they say, gosh, how do we get more of these kinds of folks? What programs can we do? I think a little bit of when we had this love affair with generals and admirals in the late 90s, that they were going to, and it turns out that the cultural dynamics of leading the U.S. military are somewhat different from trying to turn around, especially. So how do you, when you look at these great school leaders, you know, from some of these high-performing organizations, how do you figure out which skills translate into your environment?
Well, I think that we're looking at the problem in the wrong way. The problem is variability and scale. I mean, if you look at the effective schools literature, I mean, that literature is like 50 years old almost. So, and we're not learning anything new. Because those principles were all mavens and rule breakers. And what are we encouraging now? The possibility of school leaders breaking rules by having flexibility, et cetera, et cetera. What hasn't happened is the multiplication of these exemplars to scale in a place. So, you know, even the KIPP example, I have 2 KIPP schools. The higher school is one of my 2 or 3 highest performing middle schools. The lower school is a little bit more back to the pack. The question for me would be, if KIPP was running the Baltimore City Public Schools and not KIPP, would they be getting 180 great schools? And I have questions about that.
Yeah.
Well, let me
I think that they would be helping with systems and ways of doing the work that would be improving the conversation, but then they would have to change their systems and ways of doing the work, because they will be dealing with a set of constraints that they're not dealing with now. And they will have a problem of scale around recruitment or retention of people that they don't have now in particular points in places.
So I'm curious because when I talked to like Mike Feinberg about this, co-founder of KIP, just stepped down from his role in KIP Houston to be more of an ambassador. Mike is first to acknowledge that KIP principals don't have to be rule breakers. They've created a system where if you just do your job well, that you actually don't have to spend a lot of time breaking rules, which translates very differently into a lot of kind of barnacled urban systems, for instance. So how much of this, when we look at these leaders who are effective in these environments, how much is because we've actually set them free to focus on the stuff that works for kids, and how much of the skill set you need in a district principal actually looks different?
I think that a great principal is a great principal, and often there are constraints where we engineer people for failure, and just as often people engineer themselves for failure. The challenge in the high-functioning charter school conversation is that I have 60 schools run by operators among 200 schools in Baltimore, so I have pushed very hard for this stream in the work. And my challenge has been about increasing those schools and getting folks like KIP to take on more schools. And if the problem of scale is defined by the opportunity to be successful, then you will always be failing in the context of having to turn around on the dime because schools, parents are not waiting 10 years for you to be successful with their kids. Turning around huge failing schools. I have set in process takeover opportunities to take over failing schools, because you can't just close every single school in the district, and it has been like pulling teeth to get some of my most successful partners to take that opportunity.
And Anitere, one of the things you talked about was the disincentives that we sometimes create for leaders. It strikes me that, the teacher evaluation conversation, this is the case as well. The reward for being a principal who has moved aggressively to move out ineffective teachers is 100, 150 hours spent on paperwork and on minutia. That teacher bad-mouthing you in the teacher's lounge for the next 2 years before you can actually move them out. So even as we're trying to create pressure on principals to get more serious about it, it seems that the personal incentives are still for principals to not want to identify low performers and not to move. You guys obviously under Senate Bill 736 have been wrestling with this. How do you think about this at a legislative level, and what can we start to do to change those incentives on principals?
Look, part of that is the challenge of being a leader or a CEO in any company. You're going to make tough decisions and you're going to upset people, and that's going to happen. And so maybe as part of our principal preparation, you teach courses on how to develop a thick skin and say, don't worry about the people that are bad-mouthing you, because that's going to happen. That's not the silver bullet, obviously. But maybe it would help.
It's a good bullet.
One of the things that we did, and I think that one of the things that as you move to teacher evaluation systems that are more objective, you take some of that sting out. The way that we, evaluate, generally speaking, across the nation right now, our teachers is by, classroom observation, peer review, that kind of thing. Obviously, we know that certain states and certain reform movements are moving away from that and turning to much more data-driven. As you all know, that's obviously not without controversy, because the question is, what's the data? We in Florida feel very confident about our data. It's still incredibly controversial, but it insulates the principal a little bit because she's not being the bad guy. There's it's the data that shows it. You're not being effective, and I can't keep doing this to the kids. So that shields a little bit. But even in a state like Florida, where we have moved, next year we'll have data-driven teacher evaluations. The most that we could get passed in the state was that the data-driven portion has to be a majority. So it's either 50+1 or 51% or whatever of this formula. So that means that, school districts could make it, 70, 80, 100%. But that means that, quite frankly, most school districts are just going to leave it at about 51%, and then that 49% will be some sort of level of subjectivity. So that issue will still exist. But, when you have to live under the realities of legislatively, you need to get a bill passed. You need to get to a majority of votes in the Senate and the House. Unfortunately, you have to make some compromises. We still feel confident. We still feel that it's something that's going to be working. But moving towards teacher evaluation and then principal evaluation systems that are more data-driven insulate the principal a little bit. And what we've done for the principal evaluation as part of the broader teacher evaluation forum is saying that the principals are going to be held accountable to their teachers as well. So the principal will have incentives on both ends. Number one, to recommend and start the process of kind of pushing out a teacher that is not as effective, because that's going to affect them. And then on the other hand, go out into the community and really recruit teachers that are effective, because that's going to help the principal's evaluation as well. So that all should help in the broader scheme.
Christine, so as you guys are working out in the field with different districts and states, what I hear Anitere just to characterize strikes me there's kind of a push and a pull element. Mm-hmm. There's how do we make it easier by pushing on principals and pushing the expectation that they will get serious about this in a way that the widget effect showed they historically have not. Right. But there's also how do we get out of their way. Dan Weisberg tells the story when he went to the teacher performance unit in New York, that one of the problems was each stage of a teacher's grievance, principals had to leave their school and go downtown for the arbitration. And this could be 6 or 8 or 10 meetings a year. So your reward for being a principal who's moving on this is you're losing 8 or 12 hours minimum just on that you could actually spend doing stuff you care about. And if you're trying to write up 5 or 6 teachers, you're chewing up part of every week. One of the things they figured out was actually if you looked at the contract, the principals didn't have to physically go, that they could call in, and all of a sudden the disruption was shrunk dramatically. What kinds of opportunities are there, either at a practical level or at a policy level, to start figuring out how to reduce some of that drag on school leaders who are trying to do the right thing?
Well, I think one place to start might be in what's traditionally right now the Human Resources Office. So, when we go look at those places now, a lot of them are very much about compliance and about sort of processing things. But in some districts, they've really sort of rethunk everything about that. And so they have sort of a transactional side. People need to get paid on time and they need their benefits, and you'd be surprised at how often that doesn't happen. So they need people who are really good at that and making that happen, but then they need a strategic side to really think about things like where are we getting our good people from and how can we support people, and sort of reading through some of that fine print. I think, a lot of some of the more successful superintendents have a JD, and they know they're not afraid of lawsuits, and they're not afraid to take on some things that other people, or having a general counsel who's really on your side, helping you understand that not everything needs to go and be taken to the union for negotiation. So I think sort of there's a role in central office to really support school leaders, and it starts at the top and it goes all the way into that HR department that can often really be a big barrier right now.
Okay, let me throw it out to the audience. Folks would go ahead to the mic. If you'd be kind enough to identify yourself by name and affiliation. And like I said, please ask a question for 15, 20 seconds in, and we don't see a slide of question, we'll let somebody else take a crack.
Hi, Matthew Spellis, Education Week. Quick question, actually, probably for Dr. Alonso. We've heard a lot both today and this morning and yesterday about Common Core and how no one's really talked about principals in the Common Core, how pivotal they could be in the school setting to drive student achievement in underperforming schools. You talk about having to close schools, but if you had principals that can come in, is this just going to be a new thing that you layer on top of this larger structural approach you already take? Or is this just going to be a whole other ballgame for you in your schools, where it's going to have to be, more integrated? It seems like layering it becomes much more obvious if you say, well, the structure or the approach that we already take with our principals works. Common Core is just one more piece.
Great.
So I was going to mention Common Core in the context of evaluations, actually, because Common Core is going to hit schools like a ton of bricks if it is everything that it is advertised to be. I mean, we're both in the NAGB board, and if you look at the percentage of students in the country that are at proficient in the NAEP assessments, what are we talking about, like 40%?
No.
That's
Even.
okay. So many schools and many districts that consider themselves to be high achieving are going to end up with the scores of the tutor districts once this comes in, as in the districts that struggle because they have large numbers of poor kids. So for us, and you use the word structural, structure is something that is happening in one domain in the district, but there are many other things that are happening in other places. We have 10 days of professional development. And for the past 2 years, every single day has been devoted to this question of how do we move towards different expectations and different sets of skills towards the Common Core. And we started, interestingly enough, with the principal. And then part of what we learned was that that wasn't enough because principals were going back and we do lots of feedback loop surveys with teachers. What we learned is that, again, this question of variability, we were getting extraordinarily different translation of what was happening with principals around the Common Core in schools, which makes sense if you think that the principals might be in all different stages of expertness and work. So then we went back and started asking principals to bring leadership teams to do the development around the Common Core. And right now we don't do any professional development with principals around instruction that doesn't include teachers and parents as a way of ensuring that there's a buffer. And in some cases, people have struggled with letting go of that degree of control, but we've seen it as a way of multiplying sort of points of anchoring in this work. Again, you heard me talk about the span of the job, and so much of what's been going on has been around accountability and autonomy. If accountability and autonomy is not being used to develop the capacity of people to do their work differently around instruction, then it's not really going to work in the long run. So that's where the focus has been for us. None of us know yet because how is it going to play out? Is still an open question. If you look at TUDA, if you look at NAEP, you can predict that schools are going to have to really grow up very, very fast around this notion that what they consider standards are not really standards any longer.
Yes, sir.
Cameron Smith with the Alabama Policy Institute. Are y'all at all concerned that this is just bending the bureaucracy? For a state like Alabama, I agree Common Core will hit us like a ton of bricks because we're going to be asked to compete at a very high level with very high standards in the existing bureaucratic state. Do you think that maybe the model itself is outmoded and we need to move away from that sort of tweaking a public education bureaucracy and move more towards a more market-driven education in K through 12?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's obviously what these entire couple days have been about, year in and year out. I mean, it's obviously much easier said than done, but this is a kind of a constant pushing the envelope. If we had a blank slate and designed a K through 12 education system, I think that there would be little that we would keep from our current model, from the calendar year to the school location to the way that teachers get educated, principals. I mean, I don't think that there's, I don't know what we would keep. That doesn't mean that what we're doing is all wrong. Obviously, it doesn't. I mean, listen, we're still, we're still the best country in the world to live in. I mean, we still have great schools, we still have great principals, but it means that in spite of the fact that we've been doing the same thing, more or less, for the last 150 years when it comes to education, we could do things differently. Now, I guess the challenge from a policy-making position, and I know that you have the battle wounds to prove this, is to decide what battles you're going to take on at one time, because you can't just blow the whole thing up. You need to have partners with you. If you don't have partners with you, don't do it. So I think that's the biggest challenge in figuring out of this entire menu of options of innovative changes that we have to make. What are the ones that we tackle first, and when and how do we do it?
Yeah, and I agree. My caveat to that would be that the market is very much within the American fiber, but if you look at some of those countries out there that are outperforming them, they're not necessarily have market-driven systems. So, I remain agnostic about what it all means. I do think that certain things have to be common, core, consistent, that there has to be a kind of connective tissue, and that there has to be an understanding that with market forces come externalities. And in a way, what we have right now is a market-driven system in that, real estate values are determining what's happening with American education in many ways. So, and that leaves places like Baltimore that lost 500,000 people in the last 40 years, and where, the middle class has left the school system, struggling to get to a different place. And, the fact that we're making progress now suggests that there are possibilities even within the present system. The system as it exists has to change, and the question is how, within a set of constraints that are political as much as anything else.
Arthur.
Thanks. I want to put up
Introduce yourself, please.
Oh, sorry. Arthur McKee, National Council on Teacher Quality. I'm going to put up a bit of a straw man. There's things like a hypothesis, which I call the reverse field of dreams, which would be, if we unbuild it, they will come. And to say we take all the barnacles off these systems, and we're going to get these fantastically entrepreneurial, capable people into the principalship. To what extent is that what we'd say, yeah, that's a good hypothesis, it seems like the direction we should go in, versus two other problems. One is the capacity of the people that are going to take the job, period. And levels of training. We still don't know what the training should be, but to what extent can we build it? That's one issue, about capacity of those folks. The other is, how is the principalship defined? I mean, I'm on the board of a charter school. I'm sure that's going to cause lots of problems. But I am on the board of a charter school, sitting around with business leaders who look at what the principals in that charter school are being asked to do, and they say, that's nuts. And these are people, by and large, who are very successful in business who work very hard. They say, the principalship doesn't make any sense, but the charter school is successful. So to what extent is it because we have all these constraints, or is it because we're defining the principalship wrong, we haven't built the capacity of the people in it?
Let me actually throw a third piece on there. Half of all superintendents are school administrators before they're 30. More than 95% of principals have never worked a day outside of K-12 in their lives. They started as teachers. They got taught in these ghettos called a leadership program, separated from anybody else who wants to run anything else in the world. Right. How much of this is a socialization question, where even if they're good, smart people, they have no idea how to do it anyway other than how we've always done it?
But can I just say that assumes that CEOs are successful? And I mean, that's a huge bias in what you just said, Rick.
Almost everything I say is biased.
Yeah. I think I sort of touch on all the elements that you mentioned when I was making my comments. I think the talent is there. There are some amazing people working in schools. And the question is, do we identify them? Do we give them the incentives so that we don't end up passively receiving rather than Andrés, articulating?
But I mean, even stipulating the talent, I guess my question is, we've got enormously talented people who are being asked to do to take budgeting authority, to operate in new ways in terms of expectations around how they use staff, to use technology. But their entire work experience from the age of 22 has been in systems which have been organized in a certain way, which have certain cultural expectations. All of their training has been from professors at schools of education who have them. So I guess what I worry about is we talk about it as if it's just a question of talent, whereas I think I'm also curious, to what degree is it that even if we stipulate we've got terrifically talented people, what are we doing to socialize them and let them think about these things in new ways?
But we can agree that if we start with very talented people, we're going to get further. And right now we do not. And then secondly, obviously, something has to shift around development, around explicit expectations. One thing that you didn't mention that I think matters more than all these structural elements is the fact that the accountability for principals is so diffuse and undefined. As in, we might be talking about outcomes, but if there's a fire in the building, that becomes the accountability for a person who might be an extraordinary instructional leader. And this question of, can we, in districts and in states or in policy, can we get very, very clear about what matters? Can we then support people? And can we rethink that just the fact that we are so stuck on the idea of, the heroic principal going into a school is so problematic. Great CEOs, and I'm not one of them, learn how to recruit great people, how to create great teams, how to build great systems. Great principals need to do the same. And they need to do the same at a time where they have to do radical things about lifting the capacity of massive numbers of people. As in, I have 6,500 teachers. I cannot fire them all. And I have to lift them over time so that they're ready for the challenge of the Common Core. I have to rely on principals and a central team that is smaller in order to push that challenge. So all these things have to be happening simultaneously and with a degree of coherence, while at the same time allowing people to exercise their leadership, which usually happens where there's room. The reason why I'm so excited about what we're doing in Baltimore on this issue right now is that we have enough partners around the table. Education research strategies, for example, it's all about the use of resources in schools. Sitting with people who have been developing teachers, sitting with people who have been developing principals, and basically challenging us on how are we doing this work. And we're challenging them because quite often their assumptions are not the right assumptions as well.
Okay, I think we're out of time, but Anitere, Christine, I want to give you all a chance. I think that's a terrific closing note. No, I think it's a terrific closing note. But Anitere, Christine, I want to make sure you guys get a chance. Final thoughts?
Oh, I feel bad that you didn't get to ask your question.
Oh,
Can I just briefly?
Yeah.
sure.
I know Lippman Children's Scholarship Fund, but I'm speaking as a person who helped.
Sorry, that's my son back there.
That's okay. Helped basically restructure a local school district, which meant we got an entirely new board. Every building principal was changed, including the superintendent. At the end of that 12-year process, I scratched my head and agreed that culture within a school can be very stifling for change, innovative change. And I walked away feeling that the paradigm was mistaken in terms of leadership training, because after all that change, we still had ineffective principals that were replaced. The superintendent wasn't up to what I thought the community deserved. And I think it reflected how they're trained. And my question is, why can't we do something similar to the hospitals where you really have the training of principals, not on the paradigm of an educational model, but a much more business model where they go to business schools, because that would also bring life back into school districts and make them more relevant to what's going on in the real world and where these kids end up landing.
I'll address that really quick, and that'll be my closing as well, because I'm really glad that you brought that up, because I was going to answer a little bit to the previous question, is that we do have to look at how do you train principals. I don't think that as a whole, as a nation, or even as a whole as a state, you need to go around and create new principal training schools. I don't think that that's the way to go. But I know that, for example, in the state of Florida, there is a principal training program that the state funds at a certain level, the school districts fund at a certain certain level, and we send incoming principals to this prep course. That's probably just a couple of days, and it doesn't go nearly where it needs to go. But what we haven't, but you're exactly right. A great teacher can become a great principal, but he or she needs to understand what's the difference between being a teacher and between being a principal. How do I handle a budget? How do I hire and fire people? How do I deal with my new bosses, the school boards and the superintendent, et cetera, et cetera? And so there's definitely a role for that. The way that our state has handled it in a small scale, and probably something we should do more, is create at the state level and then have school districts and different entities compete for funds for sending principals to this, to this couple of day training program.
Great. Christine, last word?
Yeah, great. I guess just maybe three main takeaways. One is collect and analyze your data. You have it. Some of it is problematic. The IDs don't match every year, things like that. So if you're a state legislator, start asking questions about that, because that's really a big tool on your side. The other thing is grade those prep programs, track where the principals go, how they do, and link it back to those programs. States are already subsidizing those programs in really massive ways. This is a tool you have. And then lastly, to link, anytime you're doing teacher policy, link to principal policy. Yep. So if you've got compensation or career ladders, anything like that, just always include those two together. So that's it.
Great. That's terrific. Hey, guys, thanks. One last thought just out of this is, we hit on this a number of times. Instead of just saying we need people to do this better, it's worth thinking about if we've got talented, hardworking folks, but nobody's ever, this hospital manager analogy is a nice one, if we've never actually taught them or shown them or exposed them to how you would do things differently, that there may be limited utility in just telling them to do it better. We might need to think more about diversity of experience and insight and skills if we really want folks to make schools and classrooms work better and differently than they historically have. Hey, thanks so much for taking the time. It's been a pleasure to be here. We'll see you all soon. Thanks to the panel.